After watching the most recent Game of Thrones episode that night, I was left with a real disturbance. It wasn't something I expected to feel, but when the battle against the Night King was over and the next episode's previews were shown, I became quite literally overwhelmed with a sense of disappointment and a kind of gut-wrenching disturbed feeling, as if things were not quite right, and I did not know why. I spent a lot of time talking about it and wanted to write out my thoughts as a sort of analysis to explain why I had the reaction I did. This is not necessarily criticism or critique of the show, and obviously contains spoilers for episode 3 of season 8. From the get-go, the problem of the Night King and the White Walkers is purely existential. There's no motivation that could persuade or dissuade the Night King or any of the dead from killing the living. If we consider what the purpose of the Night King is, we would be determining his desire, since as an all-powerful being, he can effectively do whatever he wants unless he's stopped. So what is it he wants? He raises and controls the dead in order to kill the living. If we imagine that he was successful in this, what would be the purpose of his continued existence beyond that? This is a fundamental contradiction of absolute rule, because his only meaning is that there are those that are alive to dominate. It's easy to imagine that as soon as the last speck of life became overtaken by the army of the dead, and the Night King had won, that the world would basically collapse in on itself, and quick and violently compress into nothing and disappear. This conceptual problem is exactly what makes the Night King so horrifying. The fact that he doesn't want anything but the absolute abolishment of life. This problem, we find, is actually the key to some of the most tantalizing questions of human sociality and nature. The question of how we mend our differences in order to realize a collective condition of humanity in all life. Here, the struggles for life is the only thing that would allow the barriers of difference to come crashing down, if only temporarily. The thing is that those who operated in the struggle for life against death know its outcome, not just for themselves, but for humanity as a whole. It is purely a question of extinction. They're not fighting for a house or a queen anymore. They're fighting for each other. By taking the Night King to his logical end, they have also realized what it truly means to be human. That we all truly remain in this tension between life and death, and to allow names, titles, or honors to abstract the value we place upon one another as humans is doing humanity a disservice. This is exactly why, despite being at war with Cersei, the official queen and divine ruler, they act in good faith and are more than willing to fight for her, risking their own lives and even sacrificing a dragon to just try and convince her to help them, which in turn might have actually made everything worse in the battle of life and death. The struggles and realities of the show or narrative up to this point seem to dissolve just as a victory for death would. What I mean is that with this real and imminent threat, the characters actively realize that they've been living a certain lie. Their realization is purely and profoundly radical, since it doesn't just simply wish to change the hugely complex layers of social life and society to the benefit of all humans. It does change them, seemingly overnight. The ability to see this true importance on a massively collective level, which is also to say without coercion, is the radical goal in and of itself. Only then can humans live a true existence, where our collective health is also our collective motivation. The call to declare a ceasefire between the warring rulers is the acceptance that superficial human constructions are less valuable if they are actually worse for us, and if they further endanger our lives. I can't emphasize enough what a huge kind of deal I think this is. because it represents a struggle so naked and so devoid of alternatives that it has the actual moving potential which could propel mass human prosperity into the distant future, not just in the Game of Thrones universe, but in ours as well. These rulers didn't just brush past or flirt with this radical notion, they fully integrated it into their own lives and practice for a time. The importance of acting on behalf of humanity has in a way brought a peace to the world. I understand very well that Cersei and her subjects are in a position that is refusing to fight for humanity and seeks only their own personal gain at the expense of any and everyone, which seems to contradict the notion I just suggested of world peace. If we compare Cersei's ultimate purpose or desire, we see just as with the Night King, there's a fundamental flaw. Ultimate power, control, and divinity are what drives her to act in the world, and she can only do so while living beings remain. Like the Night King, the purpose of her power depends on humans being alive for her to dominate and rule. No humans, no rule. In fact, her desire to divinely rule can never be fully realized, just as the Night King's desire for absolute death cannot. If all of the humans in the kingdom suddenly submitted and desired Cersei as their divine ruler, the existential struggle of humanity would vanish, just as it would if humanity ceased to exist. She and the Night King are fighting for something that they can never truly win. The global awakening that occurs based on the threat of extinction reveals these important distinctions between the other characters who also seek to rule. Dany's overarching goal at this point is no different than Cersei's. The difference between them is how one will get there. But if we should notice anything, it's that this difference is merely superficial and pragmatic. Her belief and dedication in agreeing to fight the army of the dead is only a necessary detour from conquest. In other words, she's only willing to realize a shared humanity insofar as it allows her to reemerge from the ashes as the truly divine and legitimate ruler. Imagine, if you would, the source of some of the things that you might struggle with or that cause you discomfort or unhappiness. Economic stress is a good example. Now imagine that those forces, who would normally maintain your participation in the economic system, like the military, police, IRS, etc., suddenly observed a threat in which the entire global economic system would collapse unless something major was accomplished by the people. And in fact, the only way to avoid this threat was to then temporarily suspend the rules of the economy so that people could act in a way that was then truly beneficial to themselves and all others as living humans. After enduring the true struggle side by side, as living beings, a struggle where everything is sacrificed, where all people enduring the fight act simply for each other, what would it mean for those suspended rules to suddenly and immediately fall back into place following an intense spiritual victory where all thought they were dead anyways? The overcoming of the absolute struggle suggests a sort of transformation and rebirth that I think goes beyond ever being able to return to any way of doing things that we would be even remotely familiar with. Keeping in mind what was at stake, I watched the episode gripped by this intensity. We realize almost immediately how massively the odds are stacked against us, yet the characters persist, emboldened by the unity and strength of humanity as they struggle collectively against death at the end of the world. The sense of cohesion and of belonging is physically palpable throughout the entire battle. The selfless acts of many become the acts of one larger, symbolic whole, life. Characters' devotion and commitment to a newly realized value on human life is simply contagious. This power is carried throughout the battle in nearly every scene. While there's certainly heavy emotion in seeing some of these characters we've grown so attached to now die, mostly brutal deaths, There was something powerful I felt that wasn't grief. To imagine what it would actually be like standing on the front lines of the fight for humanity against almost certain death would disturb anybody. Humanity as such would simply be lost if they don't confront the army of the dead. And there's no killing death, as Clegane points out. What's required is not just new tactics, but new understandings about the struggle between life and death. So those who take up arms are faced with an impossible task, which they find as they are continually overrun. Despite all the impossibilities, relations of kinship and friendship, the goal of all humans becomes universally defined by the Night King. Every person's interest is the same. When we take a step back for a moment, is this not the very real, universal interest of not just humans, but all life? To remain in this tension between life and death, and to perpetuate this cycle so that it serves future life just as well or better than it does current life? The threat of the Night King, and indeed all rulers, is the actual or symbolic end to that very cycle, by releasing the tension. This is what every single person in that battle realized, that they are not fighting for abstract notions of superiority, but the real internal desire to live. When there is simply no other option, the choice is made inexplicably easier, and self-sacrifice is not a loss, but an eternal gift. While I was watching these characters fall and come close to death, I was less saddened by it than I was emboldened further in the essence of the human spirit. The reason that it was difficult to be sad about these characters being mowed down was that to be fighting there and defending life at the edge of literal extinction represents utmost commitment to the absolute struggle, rather than ones of superficiality, of names, titles, and territories. In all other wars, one is not defending humanity, but a notion of sovereignty, which is to say humanity for themselves. There's one person in all the realm whose existence is a direct knowledge of the divine. It's Bran. As we know, the three-eyed raven pretty much knows everything. The ink is dry, the old three-eyed raven told him. If in this universe time itself is already written, nothing's truly spontaneous, then the three-eyed raven in many ways represents humanity's only hope. Because what use would he be if his purpose wasn't to save humanity? Kings and queens, while they represent a divine human, do not hold real absoluteness. They maintain order or the structure of society, which is a symbolic extension of the natural order. And just as in our world today, the thought of those structures, like kings, knights, the market, politicians, simply vanishing, is akin to the end of the world. It requires an entirely new way of thinking. The monarchy is realized as both a kind of guide for humans, as well as a real part of the Game of Thrones world's nature. Royalty, nobility, honor, and these other constructs are just that. They abstract humanity, disconnecting it from its real relations. In this world, divinity speaks directly to humanity. It's easy to see why their social systems are perceived as outcomes of that divinity. The three-eyed raven is a memory of the world, and the only knowledge humans seem to have of origin. And what happens when the world loses its memory? Its knowledge of the absolute and the divine. This was a question we all asked as we saw the Night King walk towards Bran, motivated only by death. Arya, as we remember minutes before, understands not just death, but divine death. What do we say to the god of death? The Red Witch asks her. The reason I bring this up is because I want to highlight the necessary entangled relations of this world between life, death, rulers, and the divine. They are all continuous actors in each other's existence, which keeps the Game of Thrones world turning. The human connection to the divine is exercised in their spirituality or honor, be it queen, nobleman, knight, whatever. Not all the people hold the same social caste, but they all seem to accept absolute rulers as natural, with a strong preference for tolerant rulers. A ruler must always value life to an extent, if they wish to remain a ruler. There is yet one thing that ultimately blows the lid off of this. The Night King, neither living nor dead, seems to consider himself the divine ruler of humanity and the seven kingdoms. He also likely realizes that once he kills all life, that he would then be the ruler of nothing, which makes his existence the existential threat. In being so, he quite literally dissolves the social difference between ruler and ruled, by leading us to understand one universal motivation. Although we might believe that we could not have won this war without Jon Snow, Dany, or Sansa, three perspective and believe rulers, we would be remiss if we did not accept that we could not have won the war if it weren't for all the people. Rulers, not able to do much on their own, rely on the people as much as the people rely on the rulers within their systems of rule. Outside of any such system, people are able to establish their own methods of organizing that suits no better name than free folk. Being ruled is such that it is a truly implicit concept for the experience of humanity in the Game of Thrones world. All people need to be ruled, and even the three-eyed raven reinforces this nature. What the Game of Thrones universe does is depict a fantasy world that relies on fundamentally opposed notions of nature. The narrative buildup has been straddling two separate spheres of relations. One, where social hierarchies of honor are real and the absolute indicators of value, and one, where life is the absolute indicator of value. These two concepts exist within that story as a Venn diagram, with the Night King in the middle. As the Night King draws further south to more populated areas of land, the two circles become closer, ending in the same circumstance: absolute rule. All of those who knew about it and decided to participate in the fight saw these merging circles, realized where they would end up, and made a decision to act one way or the other. Cersei's refusal to help is representative of a commitment to rule, which points out the complete flaw in treating social hierarchies of honor as absolute. When faced with certain death, we are stripped of any predispositions, and we act purely on our nature and abilities. What I mean is something like, if your best friend was suddenly trying to kill you, you might be confused about this, but you would probably try to defend yourself. Or you would at least need to, because otherwise you'd be dead. If you see loyalties as absolute, you at some level act against life, as a Kingslayer demonstrates. Rulers don't need just those who are subjects to them, but very much equally those who oppose or stand in relation to them. For if all levels of a kingdom were operating as divine rule intended, the kingdoms would not be so much ruled by Queen Cersei, but by the kingdoms themselves. They need rule because they are supposedly incapable of knowing divinity and ruling themselves. But if a society were operating through divinity, then they would be truly living by the rule, or as ruler, as they would be acting on this knowledge of and access to the divine. This is where we might adjust the analysis. The Night King doesn't represent death, but the absolute ruler. He is a true merger between divinity and rule, making him capable of this kind of absolute and horrific power. In this way, he represents what it means when superficial constructs become the truth, which as we see results in only death. Humanity, we realize, should keep these aspects forever separate. One is neither truly divine or noble, and it's when they really believe that they are that they facilitate massive harm and death through exploitation and coercion. The reason that the ruler is so capable of this exploitation and coercion is because they are seen as inherently more powerful than any other. Dani truly believes in her own divinity, which, despite being the breaker of chains, legitimizes her as the master of all. To reiterate, the most important thing for rulers are not people or life, but the adherence to rules. This is something that Dani would be entirely willing to admit, I think. Just before this all-out battle for humanity, she makes quite clear that she is willing to work with everyone and comes in peace, as long as they all bend the knee afterwards. In other words, she's no different from Cersei, in the sense that she wishes to really only fight for herself. The reasons for her stationing in the north might be for love, for connection, world peace and such, but these are only important insofar as they also serve the end of her legitimate and absolute rule. What knocked over and shifted the equilibrium for me, after all of the emotional intensity and fervor displayed in a very grand and epic way, were the previews for the next episode, showing Dani celebrating, and humanity as a whole returning to the simple, superficial abstractions of politics and social caste, after having just fought the actual dead. This wasn't just unsatisfying, but it felt like I had had something removed from me. The vigor that held me the entire hour and a half, the spirit and the heroism of the ultimate commitments and sacrifice, for me, came to a really horribly disastrous outcome. That despite our collective ability to realize the value of the fundamental nature of being and to put it into practice, to say, no, life is all that matters, to participate in the only absolute struggle where we fight to be allowed to remain in tension between life and death, is to fully realize that we are first humans and second anything else, which is what any struggle in the real world for liberation or humanity must be about if it's to fight on behalf of life. What the end of this episode and the previews for the next suggest is that the symbolic struggle of life and death is now entirely resolved, and now we must focus on the superficial struggles of sociality that keep people oppressed, suffering, and unfree. Of course, as much as this battle is symbolically of life and death, what it is at the end of the day is a battle of divine rulers. Dani might not be absolute, but neither is the Night King. As such, despite the symbolic essence of the human spirit that this episode so beautifully portrays, its narrative goals are not driven by humanity, but by rule. After watching it, I realized that all of the investments I made while connecting so emotionally to their struggle for humanity became an open wound, as I realized what I was really being made to invest in. I don't think it's likely that the writers would have just all decided to abandon the entire point of the show, but bear with me. When I thought about what it would mean to seriously discard these social barriers, even temporarily, to make those commitments and sacrifice all despite an extreme odd, the grief I began to feel is with these characters who seem to have learned nothing from possible extinction. This comes right back to the example I gave earlier about global economics being suspended and then simply reinstated. When we as humans face extinction, what is made absolutely clear is that each of our positions is a part in a collective existence. This is not the way that we as a society act. It's not the way that global economics or interests act. And it's not the way that current laws act. They fragment and displace the value of human life, allowing us to occupy positions that are not of value, or just less than. If those barriers are dissolved by the threat of extinction or the Night King, those who hold the most honor, and those who hold little to no honor, even those not capable of honor, like slaves and prisoners, all collectively lose their symbolic value by being recognized of their actual value. What else might have occurred at the end of it all? To me, resolving a fundamental abstraction of life and overcoming such an absolute struggle would be the birth of something entirely unknown. It's as difficult to imagine as the level of consciousness they reach to defeat the Night King, which is why it's so upsetting seeing the power of the unknown become redirected to the entirely predictable. It is impossible to predict what would be the real outcome of an event so certainly apocalyptic, whereby the strength and dedication of the human spirit is what saves the world. But it is emotionally difficult for me to, in good faith, imagine a world where this event unfolded and then so easily slips back into the pitfall of seeing one another as more or less than human.